think we were beginning to think about the research process, identifying a topic, developing research questions, reviewing the literature. So this is what we shall be talking about. I know you have already probably selected topics. I've given some feedback, but we should probably talk some more about topics and thinking about research questions, thinking about the literature, what's important, what to include, what not to include. And so that's kind of what I want us to do. So from a practical perspective, if you have selected a topic and I have given you feedback, it probably asks two things. One, which topic? Because if you have three, then, if you have one, that's more difficult, because what if you don't like that topic? I've also included comments, for example, that you want to think about the relationship between two things. So how A influences B, or how A and B influence C. So it's not just you want to begin to think about those topics in that kind of context. We are investigating relationships, and so what we are essentially going to be making is a claim that one thing has an effect on the other, and so that is then what we test. So this also goes into the attributes of promising research topics, thinking about topics and sort of what are good topics, probably what are not good topics, and how we think about this. Thinking about the topics and research questions, some context in reviewing the literature, writing a literature review, but also sort of thinking about your outline. Like, your outline is really a very useful tool that will help you think through what are you going to include in your research, what are you not going to include. Again, we do not want you doing everything. Now, there are good topics and there are challenging topics. And when you sort of think about topics, really the topic is almost the second step. The first step is thinking about relationships, so that research question. And as we have mentioned, we are more interested in the empirical rather than the normative elements of research. So we talked about normative questions. For example, is it better? Is this what should be? Should the US give money to Ukraine? Well, that depends on if you're Ukrainian. I think you'd say yes. If you don't have money, you might be like, well, why don't I get some of that money? So the should questions, the normative questions, are things we want to stay away from. We want to think about empirical questions, relationships. So avoid, is it better? Should this be the case? Can a person be? These are all normative questions. But when we think about, so what? For example, if we know that the US is giving money to Ukraine, but what is it intended to do? And so we can evaluate whether it's actually doing what it's said or what it is supposed to be doing. I've given the clear example, for example, when Mr. Trump made his first speech when he was running for president and said, when Mexico sends its people, then you can question those. One, does Mexico send its people? Are they criminals? Are they drug dealers? Like, those are numbers, you can add numbers to those things. But they should, better, probably not. And so we sort of want to think about the measurable impact. Is Ukraine fighting better because it's receiving all this money? Is it buying more weapons? Or so those kinds of and so, for example, if you think about an example of a question like as a percentage of the U.S. population, are minority men more likely to have life-threatening encounters with police? Now, it's probably the answer is yes. Now, you can ask a further question, so it's not necessarily just the one question. As a result of these encounters, are there more deaths, less deaths, or the deaths are the same? And you might have had someone say, well, there are more deaths as a result of these encounters, and that's something you can actually investigate. So sort of think about questions that have promise as I label them. Now, these are good questions, researchable questions. So, for example, someone might say, as a result of invading Iraq, the US is safer. Is it though? Like, can we estimate or can we calculate how much safer it is? And so a question like, how much did the US invasion of Iraq decrease its vulnerability to weapons of mass destruction attack? You can actually assign a percentage to that. You can say decreased it by 50%. Now, how you arrive at that figure is an interesting prospect. How much does the composition of the teaching faculty in minority institutions influence the graduation rates? Is it a lot, some, or very little? So if you're in a HBCU and all your faculty are white, are you absolutely not going to graduate? If they are all black, are you more likely to graduate? What is a goodish number? What about questions of diversity? So you can actually you can probably come to an optimal number of when there are this many minority faculty, students have the best outcomes or the worst outcomes. The role of role models. How much does the presence of a role model influence a young person's likelihood to graduate in life or rather in school? But then the question is graduation the only good measure of success or well-being? So that might be a more, but if you're strictly asking about graduation, you can calculate that number. But is it more of graduation that we're interested in, or are we more interested in success? But then how do we define success? Is there a standard measure for success? Actually, I found out that there probably isn't. People define success differently. Some will say it's a lot of money. Others will be like it's, a whole bunch of different terms. So does the zip code a school is located in correlate with the standardized tests for this or scores for the school? Probably yes. Yeah. Resources, but also, is it the zip code that has an issue, or is it the people who live in the zip code? Or is it the wealth that is in the zip code?
Well, that's not in the zip code.
Oh, the wealth that's not in the zip code.
That don't have a lot of money that are populated by poor people.
Magnet schools?
I didn't say magnet schools.
So there are schools in zip codes, in good zip codes that are populated by?
That's not what I said.
No?
That's not what I said. Like schools and zip codes where the people don't have a lot of money. They're not getting money.
Mm-hmm.
And the schools and zip codes where the people are wealthy, they're getting all the money. So the schools in the areas with the wealthy people, they're going to have the higher test scores because they have more resources. And then the schools in the lower zip codes, lower income zip codes, they are going to have lower scores because they don't have the resources.
So the zip code is really a proxy for what? Wealth? Does family structure influence?
It's way more complicated.
So, yes,
It's like way more to it.
it's actually very complicated. But so like if someone just says zip code, really they are not just talking about zip code. There's a lot more.
We're talking about money. We're talking about race. I know every time or something, I'm like, it's race, but it
Well,
really is though.
but that is true. So but this informs discussion. So when someone, like when you hear these schools are not doing well, or
And who lives in these areas? Black people, other people of color, and then who lives in the wealthy areas? White people, and they have all the resources, and then
hence
and
our
that contributes to everything else. Like black people this, black people that. Where
and so this is a very useful discussion. And so when you are a policymaker and you hear, say, a politician just say, well, these schools are not doing well, there's so much to unpack in there, and sort of like, why are they not? And then you have to go back all the way to like even the civil rights and discrimination in housing and ability to buy housing. You have to think about redlining. And so if you have a question about the zip code a school is located in, you can see how your literature review can address so many other things before you come and say it's the zip code. The zip code carries a whole, the zip code comes all the way from West Africa, literally. Like it carries all that generational. So, again, the importance is to think about what question we are asking and what kind of judgments we can make about that particular impact. Think about, for example, a question like, does the ruling in Dobbs v. Jackson hugely increase minority women's maternal death? So Dobbs v. Jackson was the one that overturned Roe v. Wade. So does it significantly increase minority women's maternal death, so like during pregnancy? This is a very interesting question, because the Roe v. Wade was not necessarily passed to increase women's survival of pregnancies. So technically, Dobbs' ruling is not necessarily to, like, it's not, there's probably statistics that show there were more dangerous pregnancy terminations before Roe v. Wade than after. And so one of what I think will be a very interesting elements of research after the Dobbs v. Jackson is whether there's any differences. So after Dobbs v. Jackson, now we are in the pre-Roe v. Wade situation. And so if we compare that period of time, were there more maternal deaths from pregnancies, complications, as there are now? And were there more than there were after Roe v. Wade? So that would be a very interesting, and I know Dobbs v. Jackson was last year? The previous year. So there hasn't been enough time that has passed to necessarily make decisions, but you could already begin to compare pre-Roe and post-Roe. Did that make a difference? So this always, and so ultimately we can conclude that Dobbs v. Jackson has made women's choices fewer, and therefore. Now, so these are the statistical elements of these arguments. There are the moral and the empowerment questions that are not even addressed. But also, there's already existing data that shows minority women are more likely to die in childbirth and or related to pregnancies than are other women. So, the question perhaps is, how much more different is the difference? But so these are examples of good research questions that that give you somewhere to go, as opposed to, is it better for the ruling in Dobbs v. Jackson should it have happened? Like, so we are getting into the realm of normative. Should it have happened? Should it not have happened? I think as researchers, we are more interested in the impact that we can calculate. So when you're thinking about research, sort of think about these questions. There are very many sources of research topics and ideas, and this is partly what makes it so complicated, because and again, I know I told you to research something you have an interest in. And that is because if you are researching something you have no interest in, you probably... Now, in theory, we shouldn't bring our biases and our personal beliefs into them, but we do things because we have an interest in them, or we find them intriguing. So it could be lives and experiences of families or friends, family or friends. I have a student whose whole research agenda is about Black women's health, and initially she was doing disparities in health, and then she did the knowledge of skincare in African American communities and the lack of dermatologists, and it's sort of like, okay, this is interesting, but actually all of it relates. She tells it to her family, like, things that happened to her and her sisters, and so we have personal interests, we have lived experiences, we have sometimes it's class discussions, and we are thinking, so that sounds interesting and I want to know about it. We can also watch something on TV and ask ourselves, is this really, or you can read something or hear something in class. For example, my PhD thesis, I volunteered for this Center for Social Development. They were doing a bit of, what they were doing was investing in neighborhoods, and they would give groups of women certain amounts of money, and the women were supposed to start businesses. Now, so they borrowed this, and then they started doing things related to tying in with the Peace Corps volunteers, and I was evaluating the Peace Corps volunteers program for what it accomplishes. And so when I went into the PhD, I started thinking about Peace Corps and why it was started and the goals that were stated. And so Peace Corps had 3 goals. One was to provide communities abroad with skilled free labor. I wasn't sure about that, and this has nothing to do with college students, but I was like, most of the people who join the Peace Corps are students or graduates, undergraduates, or graduates of undergraduate programs. But they also go into these communities that are mostly rural, agricultural. And most Americans really don't know much about farms. So I was wondering, what do they go and tell these farmers who have spent their whole lives farming? Like, how do you improve farming if you've never been on a farm? So that is one of the goals to provide skilled expertise. The second was to make foreign populations like the United States. But even if they do like the United States, my question was, so what? Like, if I like the US, okay, what about it? Now, in theory, my estimation was that if I like the US, I would talk to my representatives, so there's better relations. But again, these are not necessarily democracies, and people's voices are not really heard. So how does that even make a difference? And the third goal was for Americans to be more aware of foreign countries and maybe have positive relations with them. And I'm thinking there has been about maybe 300,000 Peace Corps volunteers in a country of 33 million. So even when they have like talks, if you liked what you experienced in Mexico, it doesn't mean I'm going to like what you experienced. So how is that supposed to translate? So overall, I found that to be very problematic. Like none of the goals to me seemed to be very well reasoned. So you can question those kinds of things from reading, from personal experiences, but even from the news. You can, for example, this weekend, a certain candidate for presidency said that if NATO countries do not spend 2% of their GDP, he would encourage Russia to invade them. Now, maybe that's not a good research question, but I could ask a question: what leads to breakdown in military alliances? So be thinking of NATO. What would cause NATO to break up? And so even just random things people say are very good sources for topics, for research questions, for thesis questions. Now, from selecting topics, we have to think about the literature. Now, the literature review is, you want to think of it as what has been said about that particular topic. Now, it is not possible to review literature on everything that has been said about any one topic. A lot has been said about most topics. There are some topics that are newer. For example, if you want to investigate the impact of Bitcoin on national economies, that is a more recent phenomenon. But if you want to research whether racism has anything to do with slavery, I think that has been researched all the way back in time, even though we still find new ways of researching that issue. For example, and again, I try not to pick on Florida or any state in particular, but if you think about the nexus between racism and freedom of speech, which is maybe not something we always think about, the books that are being banned across the country, are they primarily by certain authors? Because again, I might propose that most, say, Black authors will write, or we have stories or literature that would include elements of race, class, gender. And so I might come up with a topic that most of the most recent book bans are targeting minority literature. And I would consider this to be an element or an extension of racism explainable through the critical race theory. And so I could research to see, like, what are the lists of, I'm sure somebody's probably making a list of the books that are banned, and sort of analyze those and see, which ones are by African-American authors. And is this another element of, say, so there are topics that have been investigated forever. There are some that haven't been necessarily that widely investigated. When Hillary Clinton ran for president, there was another, and it's not necessarily that this was new, but more people are researching whether there's any difference between women leaders and men leaders. And a study of Hillary showed that, for example, when she was speaking to different constituencies, she changed her language. So she made her language suggest, well, at least the suggestions were that she made her language sound more masculine. She did not address issues that might be thought to more directly affect women, even though you would think that most issues affect most people most of the time. And so, even though women have been half the world's population forever, there's probably still areas that haven't been researched. And so we can see what has been investigated. Literature reviews also help us to sort of concretize explanations. So, for example, when we talk about the zip codes in schools and test scores and those kinds of things, we can see what has been investigated, what some of the explanations are, but even come up with new explanations. So I don't know if we ever agreed on whether Americans are more prone to committing crimes, or the police in America are more efficient at arresting people, or that there are more laws to break, and therefore on any given day you'll break some laws, whether you like it or not. So, we can develop general explanations, some that are, I'll show you some explanations that just are not good explanations. There's some research probably we shouldn't do. But also identifying potential relationships to think about how others have defined key concepts. And we talked about this. I think we have ad nauseum defined youth. How do people define youth? Are you defining youth the way people define youth? Actually, using other people's definitions can help you avoid the heat of why did you choose for a youth to be someone who is up to 35. Also, thinking about research designs, how do people do their research? What is the best design to use? Is it effective? We talked about, for example, if you're trying to reach young people and you're calling house phones, that probably won't work. How are you going to capture their attention? Is it on YouTube, Snapchat? I hear Snapchat is not social media, but how are you going to, most of the time we are trying to improve on the research design. How can we do this more efficiently? But also to sort of see these connections. We talked about the fact that research is built on other research, but also research can take down research. If you find research that is just not well grounded, now, I'm sure you probably remember the Harvard president's saga and the idea that she plagiarized her work, and there had to be a number of corrections to her work. So sometimes if we don't do good work, other people can find fault with it. It may have been the weekend when I heard something about Dobbs v. Jackson, or maybe it was something about mifepristone. The study on mifepristone was called back. So imagine you've done this study and there's a drug in the market, and suddenly, the research turns out to have been a little off. So again, it's important to keep at the scientific rigor in figuring out if we got it right the first time or if we need to change things. So topics will generally begin broadly when you're conducting literature review, and then you're going to probably think about a more narrow question. And so if you think about, now some of this research might be very, troublesome or interesting. For example, what kinds of people become terrorists? Now, why would you want to know that? You could see a story. I don't know if you remember this young woman from Louisiana. Was she from Louisiana? And she went and joined ISIS as an ISIS bride. And so you're like, she's from Louisiana. Why are you going to Syria too? And so this is one person, but there were actually a bunch of British girls who would go to Syria to be married off to these ISIS terrorists. And so if you see an increase in young women doing that, you probably want to know what is causing them to go, like what kinds of, but maybe even more practical uses. So last week there was a hearing on Capitol Hill. Part of the hearing, I think the challenge, not the challenge, there was an exchange that was most interesting. So the senator from maybe Arkansas was trying to nail one of the CEOs, maybe of I don't think it's ByteDance, but this maybe TikTok maybe. And the CEO said he was from Singapore, and the senator kept asking whether he has ever joined the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the undertone was Singapore and China are the same thing, and these are two different countries, and you're like, so he was making clear that he's Singaporean, and he would have nothing. Singapore was actually a British colony, and so it's sort of like, why do you keep asking me about China? I'm from Singapore, and so when we have these assumptions about people, or information that is just wrong, and we need to correct it, then more knowledge is a good thing. But so when you're thinking about like the question of who uses TikTok, what kind of information are they sharing? Is TikTok dangerous to the national security of the United States? These are important questions that can be researched. I'm not sure if we have the answers yet, but so these are sort of like newer. So we can formulate specific questions based on new phenomenon, or we can get more information about specific topics. So we can hone in on the research. Some people might have asked the same questions, and so we don't need to research the same questions unless they ask them like, actually, let me point to some questions that are always asked. And so this is what often becomes panel studies. Like almost every year, Pew Research, Pew is one of the better sources of data. They ask Americans what they are most worried about. And on most years, it's usually the economy. Sometimes it depends on your political leanings. And so, for example, this year, quite a number of people have said it's the southern border, immigration. So this quite, there are topics when you want to know citizens' attitudes towards an issue, you can keep asking them the same question. A different question that has been asked often is how people feel about LGBTQIA plus individuals. And this actually shows you how citizens' attitudes change. So about 20 years ago, most Americans did not support LGBTQIA plus relationships. Come 2015, the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell. And so you kind of see the change in citizens' attitudes. And so again, all of this will help you sort of see, where do people's attitudes change? If you think about maybe interracial marriages in this country, you will probably be aware of Loving v. Virginia, 1967, which ruled that interracial marriages were illegal. But if you sort of now think about today, I'm sure there's probably still places that is an issue, but those attitudes have significantly changed. So we want to know that society is changing, and how do we know that? By studying this, by looking at the literature, and so on. One of, I think, the most interesting changes that is mischaracterized, and again, citizens would do well to know about this, is the change in political philosophies. So, for example, Barry Goldwater, who was probably not a very good person, was a Democrat. 1964, or was he a Republican? So 1964 election. If you sort of think about who the Southern Democrats were, they were kind of these not so great people. But if you go back to like the 1860s, Lincoln, so the Republicans like Lincoln are said to have emancipated the slaves. Now, so when you hear modern day Republicans talking about their connection to the African American community, they're like, yeah, Lincoln, freed the slaves. The Republican Party of then is like the Democratic Republic of now, Party of now. But if nobody makes that distinction, you'll be like, oh yeah, Republicans freed the slaves. But the ideology completely flipped. So people will make these general statements without context. And so it's for us researchers to go back into history and sometimes look at, what did that mean then? And what does it mean now? Who are the Democrats then? Who are the Democrats now? Is it the same thing? So think about when you're doing the literature review, you can start with an overly broad question. For example, do married people have different views on abortion policy than those who are single? Now, this might be something of interest to you, but you may also then want to know whether these attitudes have changed. Are attitudes towards abortion changing? Do they change based on, like, if you think about, you can parse this by age. For example, I can probably tell you that married people who are over 50 have different views on abortion policy than married people who are 20. And, this is, part of this is because older people are generally considered to be more conservative. And so if you're more conservative on abortion policy, you're probably more likely to not support. And so I'm using other information to make guesses about, but then I might actually need to go out and ask people what their policies or their views or their opinions are. But so you can start with a broad question and then narrow down on very specific questions or specific geographies. Now, remember though that we are trying to make generalizations. So it doesn't help us to know that the zip code around Booker T. Washington is, the property values are low. Like, okay, what if it's the outlier? If I go somewhere else and find property values that look like Booker T, are the test scores going to be the same? Or are they going to be slightly different? So again, think about what you're trying to explain. Even if you narrow the question, try to still have a broad explanation. For example, I don't know if if you wanted to end homelessness, say in California, I'm not sure you'd use the same strategies you'd use in Maine. So again, there's clear differences between those two areas in a way that might require you to have different, so the problem is the same, but you might have different solutions based on the climate. But so again, think about why you're doing research. Think about what you're trying to find out. You might be replicating a study. You might be trying to solve a new problem. So these will all inform your literature review. Now, we should come to the most asked question by students. The question for which I have no good answers. Well, actually, I kind of do have an answer. So students will ask how many sources you should have, how many citations, and my answer is as many as you need. So here's my sort of rule of thumb. If you read about it, if it didn't happen to you, if you were not there when it happened, if someone on the street wouldn't know about it, maybe you should cite it. And I know I don't know what the person on the street knows. They know different things. But let's say you're writing about black holes. I don't think most people would know about them. Now, if it's something that happens to everyone, For example, the January 6th insurrection, that you probably might not need to. But if you say there were 435 Capitol Police officers who are injured, I don't know that's information that's necessary in the public domain. And so you might need to, So, but generally, think about if it didn't happen to you, if it's not in the public domain. And again, it's not in the public domain for like smart people. Like there's some people who know everything, who are just slightly more knowledgeable than others. So as many sources as you have consulted as you need. Now, of course, if you are evaluating the work of others, you might need more sources. If you're doing your own analysis, probably fewer sources, especially if you're using yourself. But also, you have to know that your experiences are not the experiences of others. So that might be. If a topic has more literature, then you might need to do more, include more sources. Think about COVID-19. It's a relatively, as things go, maybe newer phenomenon. So it may not have as much, like you can quote literature from 2017 if you're talking about COVID-19. Now, if you're talking about coronaviruses, you can. So again, think about what the topic you are touching on is, what amount of literature there is. If you're talking about social media, can you really go back to before the year 2000? Probably not. If you're talking about Western civilization, you actually have to figure out how you're going to cut down on where do you start with Western civilization, which has been there forever, well, a few thousand years. So it really depends on what you're researching. But I usually say if you have a, say, 5,000 word paper without at least 20 sources, you have too few. Yeah. But also think about sources they help you write less and be more credible. Now, there was a time when truth was truth. Your sources are important where you find. So we actually want to use peer-reviewed sources. We do not want non-peer-reviewed sources. So for example, using sources that are .com, I recommend you do not have more than 3 of those. And even when you do, the way I hope you remember this. Are you old enough to remember this? Charlottesville, 2017. Neo-Nazis marching. No? So, history, 2017. Neo-Nazis came to Charlottesville and they were marching. And the president then was asked about it and he said there were fine people on both sides. Yeah, so it's sort of like there were Nazis and who? So now if you're reporting what he said, you would report that he said there were fine people on both sides. But that is not, I don't think anyone thinks that that's credible information. So just know that there's information that is in the public domain that is questionable. Now, in terms of where you find your sources, I want to mention pyramid citations. And so pyramid citations is when you find one good citation, like if you find one good source, look at their sources. And among the sources, if you find another good source, look at their sources. So that's what you're sort of like pyramid. Look at the list of notes and references, because that way that you might build your sources much easier than if you have to search for all these sources yourself. Google Scholar is amazing. Now, I say Google Scholar as opposed to say Google Books, because Google Scholar will give you both articles and books. And so, for example, if I was searching for political socialization, minorities, and education level, so I want to know whether political socialization among minorities is influenced by the level of education, this would probably give me some good sources. And so this would be some of the sources that I find. And so usually, like if you're on campus, you will probably see available at Norfolk State. And then you can access those. Off campus, you can also still do that. And usually you probably have access to everything that's on JSTOR. Some students will only search JSTOR, but I recommend actually looking at Google Scholar. Now this entry, for example, is a Google Books entry. And so usually it's going to show you the specific pages that have those. Now, this information on saving the sources, if you are logged into your Google Scholar profile, but we're not necessarily going to focus on that, but it's important. In these days, there are all kinds of citation tools to help you do the citations, but I also think that it's a good thing to know how to do your citations. But also, as you go along, have a list of citations so you don't forget where you got them, or then you have to build a reference list and you really can't remember where you found some information. So think about how the references will fit together, like the things that you're reading, that they are connected to each other, they are not off the beaten track, and that your literature review is cohesive. So you're building a narrative, you're telling a story with your literature review. I mentioned something maybe about having an outline. So even if you're doing your outline, think about what your literature review will look at. For example, let's say you want to see the impact of housing on generational wealth, or the impact of home ownership on generational wealth. Now, if I was doing research like that, I might go back all the way in short steps to during, or actually slavery, and think about who could own what during slavery, and sort of think about the major periods during which different communities could own things. So like between 1500 and maybe 1865 would make one period, and then after emancipation, was it easier to own? But even the period between the beginning of slavery in 1865, I might split it into the North and the South, where, say, African Americans in the North more likely to own property or not. Now, the South, of course, we know they were not. And so then after the emancipation, after the Civil War, was home ownership easier or not? And then after the civil rights, was it easier or not? Then after the FHA, was it easier or not? And the answer might be probably easier than before, but not the same as. So if you actually look at like the statistics, I think home ownership in the white community is like 81% and black communities like 47%. So it was probably easier than before, but it's still not the same. So I'd be making the point that, home ownership for African Americans after 1865 was 16%, but for white it was 95%. So you build a narrative that comes on to show how wealth disparity has continued. And so you see, I cover a very long period, but cover it without digging into everybody who had a home or who did not. So sort of think about how your references, how your narrative fits together, what story you are telling. Now, again, remember, not all information on the internet is reliable. This is the last thing we'll say, but I don't know if you heard of Pizzagate. Did you hear of Pizzagate? So I looked into the Pizzagate, and apparently the gentleman who came up with that story, his whole job was to wake up and write a fake story. Like that's your job. And some people believed it. And this guy went to Washington, D.C. with a rifle to shoot the people who are trafficking in kids. So now I think that is over the top. Like, yeah, why are you going to shoot? Now, he was doing the country a good service. He is trying to stop the sexual trafficking of children, but he didn't really look into, is this? I have shared with you Kim Jong-un's story about him being the sexiest man alive. So there's a lot of information out there that is just bad information. And if you're using it, now maybe the latest that was most fascinating to me in a morbid way was when Mr. Trump told people to inject bleach. Or, I mean, he asked if people can inject bleach. There are people who heard inject bleach. I'm sure there's people who injected bleach. There are people who took ivermectin, horse medicine. And so these are the dangers of these kinds of information.